Welcome back to Robot Cantina. Choke down some spoonfuls of them Apple Jacks, take the last slug of that coffee, grab your hat and fishing pole, and let's take the day off. Just kidding. In this episode, things are going to get hot, real hot, and we're going to try to find out why, and perhaps solve a few mysteries. Today we're going to experiment with supercharger oils, and maybe do some inventing, and then take the car out for a road test. If this is your first visit to the channel, well, here's the backstory. We took a Honda Insight, stripped out all the unnecessary stuff, then put a cement mixer engine in it. It's not the best choice of engines, that's for sure, but that's what makes this challenge fun. Oh, the challenge, I guess I should mention that. We're trying to get this car to go 70 miles per hour with a little 420cc engine. So far we managed 65 miles per hour, and we're working on the last 5 miles per hour. We've done a lot to this engine, and if you want to learn more, your best bet is to watch previous episodes. But all you really need to know today is we're running a Speeduino NO2C fuel injection and an AMR300 supercharger. Oh, there's a lot more than that, but that's just the basics. The problem we have encountered at this stage is the supercharger is putting out a good 5 to 7 psi as a boost, but unfortunately the temperature of the supercharged air is well over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and now we're losing more power than we're making. The simple solution is to add an intercooler, and yeah, we're definitely going to do that. But the correct intercooler is experiencing delays in shipping. So today we're going to take a closer look at why the supercharger is running hot and try to determine if the oil we're using is part of our problem. Now, keep in mind we're aware that a positive displacement supercharger generates a lot of heat, but we think this one's running hotter than normal. The supercharger that we're using to boost our 420cc engine is not just a random part that fell from the sky. No, you see, originally this type of supercharger was used on a tiny Japanese kei-class automobile or truck for the Japanese domestic market. Apparently in Japan, they make these little cars and trucks, and currently the maximum displacement allowed is a mere 660 cc's. But the cool thing is, because the engine size is limited to 660 cc, the various manufacturers have built some pretty crazy engines to get the most amount of power from such a tiny power plant. And of course some of them were supercharged. So the AMR300 that we're using, well, I couldn't find out exactly what kind of car it was originally from, but the slightly bigger AMR500 supercharger, well, that was a little easier to research. From what I was able to find out, the AMR500 was used on the Subaru Rex and probably a bunch of other cars. But we're going to focus on the Rex because that was the easiest one to research. This little car has a 660cc 4-cylinder supercharged intercooled engine. Wow, a 4-cylinder 660cc engine, and as I understand, some of the older models had a 550cc 4-cylinder engine. Anyway, cool looking car. Let's take a better look at that engine. Okay, so here's the supercharger, and wow, they put it right next to the exhaust manifold. Now this engine is equipped with an intercooler, but some of these cars were offered with a supercharger, but without an intercooler. That's insane. So the supercharger is right next to the exhaust, and that's a bit sketchy. Anyway, it looks like they have the supercharger right in front, and it seems to have good airflow. Now on our street legal go-kart, we put the supercharger right out front, directly in the airflow. Good planning, or was that random? Now, this was the best picture I could get of how all this stuff fits together. Right here they have the throttle body, and it feeds into the supercharger through this convoluted piping. Interestingly enough, we can see a bypass system to redirect the air directly into the intake manifold to keep the supercharger from experiencing vacuum at idle. All this stuff is fun to look at, but I do have some questions. You see, how do they keep the supercharger from getting too hot, and what kind of oil does it use? Because the crappy documentation that I got says to use 80-90 weight gear oil, and that ain't working. So a little more digging, and sure enough they make specialty oil for the AMR500, and theoretically that should also work on the AMR300 supercharger. Well, as luck would have it, this stuff is out of stock. Meh. So let's do an experiment and record the temperature profile of the supercharger when it's filled with 80-90 weight gear oil. You see, I believe the incorrect oil that we're using is causing the supercharger to run hot, and it's transferring heat directly into the induction system. So here's the catch, right? Who cares? After all, we're going to install an intercooler, and that all by itself will drop the temperatures. And that's true, but if the supercharger is running hot because of the wrong type of oil, well, I think eventually we can expect the supercharger to fail. So on our little 420cc air-cooled engine, we mounted the coolant temperature sensor to the engine block at this location. This sensor is for the electronic fuel injection computer. Anyway, being this is an air-cooled engine, it's hard to find a good spot that has stable temperatures. For today's experiment, we're going to move the temperature sensor from the engine block over to the supercharger. Now the reason we're doing this is so we can data log the temperature of the supercharger housing by using a feature in Tuner Studio. We figure the oil inside the supercharger will be about the same temperature as the housing. Keep in mind we're using instruments and resources that we have on hand. This test may not be perfect, but it'll be close. The air coming from the supercharger passes through this pipe before it gets to the throttle body on the engine. Now we're going to monitor the air temperature from this sensor here. In the previous video, we modified the induction system to have two throttle bodies. One throttle body is at the engine and one is before the supercharger. And the reason for the twin throttle bodies is to keep the engine vacuum from reaching the supercharger at idle. Now for the turbo crowd and the armchair mechanics, the twin throttle bodies is a bit bizarre. But this is standard practice with a remote mounted positive displacement supercharger. If you still don't understand why we set it up this way, then you might want to do some research. Don't forget, this is a positive displacement supercharger system and definitely not a turbocharger. The rules are different. Okay, so let's have a look at the test procedure. We are going to do a cold start and let the engine idle for 20 minutes. Then we're going to place a fan near the supercharger to simulate airflow, and we'll do this for 10 minutes. Next, we'll disconnect the induction pipe at the throttle body and let the engine idle for 10 minutes with no fan blowing on the supercharger. And finally, we'll turn the fan back on and blow air across the supercharger while it's still disconnected from the throttle body, and we'll do this for 10 minutes. This baseline test is going to be conducted with the recommended 80-90 weight gear oil. Now this ain't the same oil Subaru recommends, this is the oil the vendor recommends. Okay, before we get started, keep in mind this gauge says coolant temp, but it's actually the supercharger case temperature. And of course this gauge is the air intake temperature, and we're measuring this after it passes through the supercharger. Now I sped up this quite a bit because some of you folks have to cut your lawn today, and I doubt you want to sit around for 20 minutes to watch the first part of this test. Okay, so I paused it here, and we can see at idle both the supercharger and the air temp creep up to just under 200 degrees Fahrenheit. If we let the test run longer, the temp continues to increase to several degrees above 200 Fahrenheit. Let's turn on the cooling fan and blow some air across the supercharger. So right away we can see the airflow helps keep things cool at idle, but at wide open throttle, well, that's still an unknown. So after 10 minutes with the fan blowing across the supercharger, we dropped the temperature quite a bit. Now let's disconnect the induction pipe from the throttle body and let the supercharger pretty much spin and do nothing. Normally we have the system set up to provide a tiny amount of positive pressure, and this helps keep the oil from leaking out of the supercharger. Okay, so now we have the supercharger uncapped and no cooling fan. Let's run this for 10 minutes. So with the supercharger just spinning and without a cooling fan, we can see the temperatures creep up again after 10 minutes. Alright, for the last 10 minutes, we'll turn on the fan and blow air across the supercharger while it's still disconnected and see what that does. Okay, well that was the baseline test with the 80-90 weight gear oil. I didn't really see anything that was unexpected, and I think the most important thing we learned is the cooling fan helps keep the supercharger case temperature down at idle. I think at this point, we'll focus on the 20-minute idle portion of the test and see if any of the other lubricants fare any better. I'll do the rest of the tests off camera, and we'll take a look at the screenshots after the 20-minute mark without a cooling fan. The next one up is the AC Delco synthetic supercharger oil. So in case you're wondering, after each test, the engine and the supercharger are cooled down for well over an hour. We basically wait until the starting temps are the same on all the tests. So the AC Delco supercharger oil did better than the gear oil after 20 minutes idling. The only thing I didn't like about this stuff is it's very thin and it may leak out of the supercharger. After all, this supercharger is a used part and probably has seen better days. So the supercharger case got up to 187 degrees Fahrenheit and the air temp got up to 189 degrees. Next up is 10W40 motor oil. Meh, this stuff sucks. Let's move on. Next up is Royal Purple Max ATF, and of course this stuff is synthetic. Well, the Royal Purple did better than the AC Delco supercharger oil, and we saw 185 degrees Fahrenheit on the supercharger case, and the air temp was 188 degrees Fahrenheit. So the next one up is Prestone's synthetic power steering fluid. Somehow I felt compelled to try this. Let's see how it does. Well, the power steering fluid works about the same as the AC Delco supercharger oil. Now that doesn't mean it's good, and I think we'll pass on this one. The last one we're going to try is Tribodyne supercharger oil. I saw this stuff on the Jumbo site and thought, why not? It could be snake oil, or it may work. Let's find out. Well, the Tribodyne seems to live up to its claims, and I'm a bit surprised. This stuff might be what we're looking for. Alright, well here's the scoreboard. Tribodyne is clearly the winner in the 20-minute idle test, but here's the catch. All these oils will go above 200 degrees Fahrenheit if we let the car idle long enough, even the Tribodyne. The thing about the Tribodyne is, it takes longer to get 200 degrees Fahrenheit at idle. Now, 200 degrees Fahrenheit is not really a critical number as far as temperature goes. It's probably fine all things considered. The problem is, we're seeing high temps at idle, and at this point we really don't know how hot the supercharger was getting on our previous road tests. Now, it's extremely likely the oil temps followed the air temps, and on previous road tests, we saw the air temperature range between 240 and 260 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's probably too hot for most lubricants. The simple solution for our supercharger temperature problem is to go with the best lubricant on the list and also install a cooling fan. Now, I'm on board with using Tribodyne as a lubricant, but a cooling fan is going to get in the way of a lot of stuff. You see, it's in an awkward location, and we still need to install the intercooler. So now what? Well, what about water cooling the supercharger? You know, it's funny you should say that, because that's exactly what we did. Actually, at this point, it's mostly a science experiment, but it works. With this rig, we were able to stabilize the supercharger temperature, and now it'll hold between 150 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit at idle. Pretty much forever. We stopped data logging after an hour. So for reference, the supercharger sits in the car like this. Now this part covers the gears inside the supercharger and holds in all the oil. Conveniently, there are two flat spots on this cover, and that might be all we need to extract some of the heat from the supercharger. So this thing is a cooling block, and normally it's used to keep the computer microprocessor cool. Yeah, it's crazy, but I guess some high-end gaming computers use liquid cooling systems now. Well, anyway, this cooling block fits perfectly on the side cover. Of course, we had to whip up some spacers on the lathe so we could clamp the heat block to the supercharger cover. To top it off, we used this thermal paste to help improve heat transfer. So you folks already met this guy, and we'll get to this thingy in a moment. But first, let's take a look at that radiator system. So this radiator looks like it should be on a motorcycle, but it's for a computer. We found this thing on the Jungle site for $50, and well, I really wanted to try it. Of course, they make more expensive units, but this one looks like it's pretty well made. So basically this thing has twin fans and twin water pumps. Not too shabby. The water goes in and out of this cooler through these two pipes and gets connected to the cooling block. Well, sort of. On this system we're using a reservoir to fill and bleed the cooling lines, and trust me, bleeding this system of air pockets takes some practice. So now we have to take this science experiment and make it fit in the car and still leave room for the intercooler. Fast forward a little bit and it's all in. Everything's tied down and ready to test on the road. Now for the road test, we'll run the car with the hood off just to keep everything cool for now, but I think we pretty much have all the basics under control. Let's take a look. Well, we put down a few miles, and as you can see the intake temp certainly is elevated. But that's a problem for the intercooler that we'll be installing next. Our biggest concern, of course, is the supercharger temperature, and as you can see, we're doing well. Almost. You see, at this part of the road test, we encountered another problem. Now, can anybody guess what we broke? Well, if you said head gasket, bingo! Yeah, I'm afraid we popped the head gasket. Anyway, amazingly enough, the car still ran, so let's take a look as we attempt to get the car back to the shop. So even with a blown head gasket, the little engine can easily get the car up to speed. Simply amazing. Now that thumping sound you're going to hear is the exhaust rattling around and nothing to do with the head gasket. So at this point we're making about 5 psi of boost, and of course the intake temps are high, but keep an eye on the supercharger temps. Now given everything that's happened, I'm calling this a success. So we got our hands full this week. On top of everything else, we have to dig into the engine and replace the head gasket, and then we can install the intercooler. Now, if you watched the end of the previous video, the intercooler that we showed was huge. And that was sort of a joke, and I think most of you caught that one. The correct one is a lot smaller, and the good news is it finally showed up today. So I'm pretty excited to get it installed as soon as I can. Now today we have a package that a viewer sent, and I've been kinda itching to open it. It's been sitting on the shop floor for a few days, but I've been too busy to deal with it. Oh, many boxes. Oh, I see. They're there to fill in the voids. Looks like a tiny turbo. Nice. Although Aaron didn't leave a note in the box, I believe he mentioned this turbo was from a 1.8 Volkswagen of some sort. This just seems tiny for a 1.8 liter engine. Oh, and here's another turbo. Yes! You can never have too many turbos. Thank you, Aaron, and we'll be using these in an upcoming project. Well, it's late Saturday evening, and I have to get this video out by tomorrow, so I guess I'll see you folks next time.